The ICF Training and Technical Assistance team is honored to welcome you to this California Housing and Community Development training session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. I'm Chris Pitcher from ICF, and I'll be hosting today's session. Today's training session is entitled ESG and ESG-CV Deep Dive into Rapid Rehousing. It is my privilege to introduce today's first speaker, Matt White.
Great, thanks, Chris. And thanks for viewing this training. I'm Matt White. I'll be presenting the ESG-CV Deep Dive of Rapid Rehousing with my presentation partner, Nora Lally. In a moment, I'll ask Nora to introduce herself. I come to the program model of Rapid Rehousing after nearly 20 years of practice and refining of the model. I first worked with the community of Columbus, Ohio in the early 2000s as we experienced increased demand for homeless services and a need to accelerate exits out of shelter and into permanent housing. Rapid Rehousing emerged as a model for Ohio to quickly reestablish stable housing for families experiencing homelessness. Then about 10 years ago, I worked with the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs to standardize the model of Rapid Rehousing for their Supportive Services for Veteran Families initiative. As we walk through a deep dive of Rapid Rehousing, I'll share some of those insights and emerging best practices. So we've identified several key learning objectives for you today, presented on the slide. Not only do we want to ensure you understand the basics of ESG participant eligibility, eligible activities, and costs, but we'll also share some important information and allowable uses that are specific to ESG-CV, a component of the CARES Act. You'll learn about important types and differences of rapid rehousing, such as tenant-based, project-based, and sponsor-based strategies. You'll understand the concept of duplication of benefits to ensure you avoid that prohibition. And finally, we'll talk about best practices, especially for communities struggling with high rental costs and low vacancy rates. Our training agenda today aligns closely with the training learning objectives. First, we'll start with basics. We'll talk about participant eligibility, eligible uses of ESG for rapid rehousing. We'll walk through some very important distinctions of ESG-CV funds, which look similar to regular ESG, but have important differences. We'll talk about waivers of requirements and some special flexibilities allowed with ESG-CV, and we'll talk about duplication of benefits, as I mentioned earlier. So let's get started. First, I'd like to cover some very foundational but very important basic principles. What is rapid rehousing? Rapid rehousing is a housing intervention for persons experiencing homelessness. The concept is basically a very quick transition from homelessness back to stable housing through the use of short or medium-term rental assistance and housing stabilization services. Rapid rehousing is time limited. The goal is to very quickly resolve the immediate housing crisis, not provide long-term supports associated with anti-poverty programs. The assistance is progressive, which means allocated based on the participant's need, and all of the case management services are housing focused. Even though many participants may have other social service needs, the function of rapid rehousing is only to resolve the housing crisis and support the household's transition to stable housing. Rapid rehousing assumes that participating households are resilient and will be able to resolve their housing crisis with short-term assistance. Many of you are familiar or at least have heard of the term housing first. This is a basic tenet of rapid rehousing. Housing first is a philosophical approach that sequences the housing intervention before other important services. Even though many participants could benefit from behavioral health treatment, income supports, family counseling, and other services, housing is understood to be a foundational element which is supplied first. all the other services and supports are built on a stable, safe, and supported housing platform. Another foundational element of Housing First is participant choice. We've seen through national monitoring that households tend to do much better with their housing sustainability when they have choices about where to live, the service intensity, and participate in defining the case manager-client relationship themselves. Another important element of ESG-CV funding is the requirement that recipients and subrecipients follow HUD's equal access and non-discrimination rules. This means that ESG-funded projects must have written policies and procedures that ensure all persons have equal access to rapid rehousing, regardless of the household's membership in a protected class as defined by federal civil rights laws. ESG-funded rapid rehousing projects may not make programmatic decisions such as referrals, admissions, or rejections based on a participant's color, race, gender, age, familial status, disability, national origin, or religion. In addition, the Equal Access Rule requires ESG-funded projects not discriminate based on sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. This slide lists some other foundational elements. For example, people presenting as a family, however they define or constitute their family, must be served collectively as a family. Another important basic principle of rapid rehousing is the requirement to establish a set of written policies and procedures that govern the operational practices of rapid rehousing. Written standards will help to ensure consistency and clarify performance expectations. Some examples of standards are included on this slide, but these are just examples. The written standards your community establishes may be different. You might want to investigate sample ESG written standards and rapid rehousing policies and procedures at HUD's website, hudexchange.info. Now that you have a quick overview of rapid rehousing basic principles, let's dig into more specifics. I'm going to turn it over to Nora so she can introduce herself and walk us through basic eligibility.
Thanks, Matt. Hello, my name is Nora Lally, and I'm happy to be here today for this deep dive into rapid rehousing. My experience with rapid rehousing goes back to HUD's first specific investment in the model, which occurred in 2009 through the Homelessness Prevention and Rapid Rehousing Program, which some of you might remember affectionately as HPRP. At the time, I was working for HUD in the Chicago field office with recipients and subrecipients to design effective and compliant HPRP programs. Now, flash forward over 10 years, and I'm working on the most recent stimulus funding through ESG for rapid rehousing for the coronavirus response, more commonly known as ESG-CV. And now that Matt has outlined the basic principles of rapid rehousing, I'd like to review some of the specifics of rapid rehousing as it's funded through HUD through ESG-CV or annual ESG. And throughout the presentation, we will draw distinctions in requirements where they exist between what you can do with ESG-CV and what you can do with ESG annual funding. In order to operationalize ESG-funded rapid rehousing, it's important to understand certain requirements of the program, like participant eligibility. For ESG rapid rehousing, eligibility comes from people being on the street, in a shelter, or in a place not meant for human habitation, or other situations of literal homelessness. The words rehousing reinforce that a key element is that people needing this resource are not currently housed. Also, if people are fleeing or attempting to flee a situation of violence, and are also literally homeless, they are also eligible for rapid rehousing. ESG rapid rehousing pays for two activities, the first one being rental assistance, and the second one, housing relocation and stabilization services. Rental assistance means the cost of paying rental arrears or rent for either short term, which is considered 1 to 3 months, or medium term, meaning greater than 3 months, but less than 24 months. Housing relocation and stabilization service activities cover costs that are associated with renting, but are not the monthly rental payment. These can be financial assistance costs like rental application fees, security deposits, last month's rent, utility deposits, utility payments, and moving costs. And for security deposits, this is one of those distinctions where there's a difference between what ESG-CV can pay, which is up to 3 months of security deposits, and what annual ESG will pay, which is up to 2 months of security deposits. The activity here also pays for supportive services, which research and rapid rehousing program evaluations have shown to be vital to success in rapid rehousing. In annual ESG, the scope of services provided must be narrowly focused on housing. However, ESG rapid rehousing services have been expanded to include all of the essential services allowed in the emergency shelter component, like education services, job training, mental health services, and in addition to those listed here. As you can see on the slide, there's more description of the housing search and placement activities. This goes into more detail about what this actually means. So that success, because it's such an important part of a successful rapid rehousing program. Housing search and placement means the process rapid rehousing program staff go through to quickly and successfully house people. It's important to know that the time and resources spent assessing participant barriers, needs and preferences, outreaching to landlords, conducting a housing search, determining unit compliance, and other activities listed here are eligible costs of ESG rapid rehousing programs. Housing stability case management, we can also understand it a little bit more easily if we look at the activities associated with it, such as using coordinated entry, coordinating services, developing a housing and service plan to maintain housing, and always reevaluating the progress of a household as they are working and participating in a rapid rehousing program. It's important to note that with ESG-CV funds, programs can't require program participants to utilize housing stability case management. And even though this resource can't be mandated, it should always be provided, offered, and encouraged. Rapid rehousing takes on various shapes depending on the kind of HUD funding that it is supplied with. So we wanted to spend a little bit of time walking through the differences of rental assistance based on the source of HUD funding. So just as a refresher, it's important to know that rental assistance under the Continuum of Care program can only be tenant-based rental assistance. With ESG annual funding, the rental assistance provided can be either tenant-based or it can also be project-based. And with ESG-CV funding, the rental assistance can be tenant-based, project-based, and now there has been the addition of a sponsor-based component for rental assistance. We'll talk a little bit more about these on the next slide to give a little bit more detail about what those words mean. In tenant-based rental assistance, the rapid rehousing program participant selects the unit and signs the lease. It's important to remember here too that all the housing search assistance is allowed through the housing search and placement eligible activity of rapid rehousing. So the cost can be covered, but the household is ultimately the entity that makes the choice of where they will be receiving the assistance, where they will be staying. In project-based rental assistance, the recipient or subrecipient signs a lease with a property owner, and then the program participants sign subleases with the ESG recipient or subrecipient. And in the sponsor-based model, recipients or subrecipients own or lease the units, and then sublease one or more units under contract to the program participants. Later in the presentation, Matt will provide more information about the sponsor-based model. And now I'll turn it back to Matt to talk about some additional nuances for ESG-CV funded projects.
Great, thanks, Nora. So as we discussed earlier, ESG-CV is similar to regular ESG or ESG annual, but there's some important differences. So we'll walk through some of those additional eligibility activities under ESG-CV that impact rapid rehousing. And we'll also discuss unique ESG-CV flexibilities and some requirements for regular ESG that are waived for ESG-CV. So some additional flexibilities. The most recent ESG-CV notice, and that was released in late July of this year, establishes additional flexibilities that are specifically designed to accelerate ESG-CV spending, support landlord recruitment efforts, and address unique challenges of providing rapid rehousing assistance during the emergency health orders associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. Recruiting landlords to participate in rapid rehousing program can be challenging. So ESG-CV provides some additional flexibilities that are intended to make ESG-CV funded rapid rehousing more attractive for prospective landlords. For example, you can provide a signing bonus to a landlord or a property management company simply for their commitment to execute leases and with participating households. You can provide a security deposit, as Nora said, equal to 3 months of rent. You can provide additional funding to landlords or unit damages that exceed those that are not covered by the deposit. FMR, or fair market rent, is typically the standard for determining the allowable limit of rent that can be assisted with ESG funds. ESG-CV funds allows rapid rehousing recipients and subrecipients to use rent reasonableness as a slightly more permissive standard and the one that might be less burdensome to certify. Regular ESG limits the amount of rent assistance to no more than 24 months in a 3-year period. ESG-CV now waives that restriction. ESG-CV allows recipients and subrecipients to use sponsor-based rental assistance. This is where the recipient or subrecipient holds the lease and then sublets to eligible participants. This is particularly useful in structuring a rapid rehousing project that's new to the ESG program, and we'll talk more about this later. I think it impacts some of the challenges that California providers might be experiencing. Some landlords may be more willing to rent to tenants with questionable backgrounds if you include renter's insurance in the assistance package. Renter's insurance is now an allowable cost. And remember that ESG-CV funds expire at the end of September in 2022. So that's less than a year from now. And currently there is no federal allowance to extend or renew ESG-CV funding. So it essentially ends in just 11 more months. Let's continue with some additional flexibilities. With ESG-CV, you can now purchase household items for participating clients. But this can be a little bit tricky. Anything purchased for the household with ESG-CV funds must be returned to the recipient or subrecipient when the client terminates or when the program ends. Those items are only allowable while the program participants are receiving rapid rehousing assistance. One exception that I wanted to note, though, is a mattress. Mattresses can be purchased for program participants, and they can be retained for the participants' use beyond the period of ESG-CV assistance. Also, with ESG-CV, you can purchase personal protective equipment. This includes face masks, gloves, sanitizer. You can provide incentives for clients to get vaccinated. You can provide cell phones while the participants are enrolled. You can provide laundry services to eligible participants. And you may need to make adjustments to your coordinated entry system to account for the new referral functionality associated with ESG-CV. Updates to prioritization or to sorting criteria, or adding in new resources associated with ESG-CV or the emergency housing voucher or other CARES Act or ARP funding are now allowable under ESG-CV. All of those changes to your coordinated entry system or process may be funded with ESG-CV funds. So now we're going to shift to waivers and alternative requirements, and I'll walk through some of those. There are 9 important waivers. I think the slide is showing the last set of 9, but I'm just going to quickly walk through the first set. ESG-CV recipients and subrecipients may fund the acquisition, rehab, and operation of temporary emergency shelter. Those temporary shelters may be retained as regular emergency shelter with no disposition requirements after the pandemic, as long as the facility continues to operate as an emergency shelter. As we touched on earlier, ESG-CV allows for a whole set of new activities. Remember, I mentioned temporary cell phones, laundry services, vaccine incentives, renter's insurance, and sponsor-based rental assistance. So all of that is now flexible. Those flexibilities are included in ESG-CV. And for ESG-CV participants who are being reevaluated for ongoing assistance, the income limit is now 50% of AMI instead of 30% AMI, which it was previously with regular ESG annual funds. Okay, now the last set of waivers and alternative requirements. On this slide, we outline those last sets. So project-based rapid rehousing may cover the unit rent for a period of 30 days while a participant prepares to move in. So essentially while the unit is vacant. Program participants may receive up to 24 months of financial assistance. Previously, the ESG-CV limit was just 12 months. So now we have more flexibility to assist participants for longer periods of time. Remember though, that ESG-CV funds expire at the end of September of 2022. So we're now just 11 months left of the program. Rental units must meet housing quality standards or HQS. This is a more permissive standard than habitability, which was the previous requirement. Providers may support program participants for up to 60 days with housing relocation assistance while the participant seeks housing and prepares to move in. This is a longer lead time and it provides more flexibility to find suitable housing when in-person client contact may be limited in certain jurisdictions due to the pandemic and social distancing requirements. And recipients may sub-award ESG-CV funds to Native American tribal governments. Tribes were not previously allowed to be ESG-CV recipients or subrecipients. Okay, so let's walk through some of the waivers that are allowed with ESG-CV. Recipients are not required to match their ESG-CV allocation with additional resources. There is no match requirement. Fair market rent or FMR is waived. Remember though, units must still meet rent reasonableness. Previously, ESG-CV recipients were required to coordinate the types and amounts of assistance with the appropriate C of C governing body. That C of C consultation requirement is now waived. ESG-CV recipients are not required to coordinate their ESG funded activities with other targeted homelessness services. That previous requirement is now waived. ESG-CV recipients are not required to coordinate ESG funded activities with other systems and mainstream resources. That previous requirement is now waived. ESG-CV recipients may put up program participants in hotels or motels as a form of temporary emergency shelter that allows for the necessary social distancing and maybe quarantining in a non-congregate setting. ESG-CV funds can pay for cleaning, damages, and repairs to motel units. Some additional ESG-CV waivers and flexibilities. Rapid rehousing rental assistance limits have been waived. Previously, assisted households could only receive up to 12 months, and then it was extended to 24. That restriction is waived. Again, however, we only have 11 months remaining in the life of the ESG-CV program. ESG-CV recipients are not required to follow the existing procurement protocols for their jurisdiction. So you can use ESG-CV funds. They can be expedited to subrecipients, Any alternative procurement standards that you've used still have to be documented though. Consultation and citizen participation requirements are now waived. Each recipient still must publish how it has used and will use its ESG-CV allocation. You can do that on the internet or at the appropriate government website or through electronic media. Continuing with some additional waivers and flexibilities. Housing stability case management. Participants may be assisted with case management for up to 60 days while the participant seeks housing. The environmental review requirements are waived for temporary emergency shelters that are used to prevent, prepare for, or respond to the coronavirus. Project-based rental assistance. We'll talk more about project-based in just a moment, but some important features to mention now include the recipient or subrecipient may pay 100% of rent payments prior to a participant moving in while the unit is still vacant. The recipient or sub may cover 30 days of rent during unit turnover. So if a participant moves out but someone else hasn't moved in, you can still cover the rent of that unit. Recipients or subrecipients may require a program agreement with the participant. So it's maybe a sublease or another type of agreement that explains or establishes program participation expectations. Now I'm going to ask Nora to share some information about duplication of benefits.
Thanks, Matt. The ESG-CV notice requires that ESG recipients have adequate procedures in place to prevent a duplication of benefits. So in the next few slides, we'll walk through what a duplication of benefits means, when the requirement applies, and the analysis that has to be conducted in ESG-CV funded rapid rehousing programs. The first thing I want you to know is that a duplication of benefits is a scary sounding phrase, but it really just means ensuring that resources aren't provided in excess of need. It occurs when a household receives assistance from multiple sources for the same expense, for example, rent, and the amount of assistance it received was more than the actual cost. So really looking at the phrase duplication of benefits contains the word that explain it. The benefits a participant household received are duplicating each other. So meaning that the household received assistance from multiple sources to cover the same costs or to cover more costs than there actually were. An important element of duplication of benefits is the policies and procedures that program participants and recipients and subrecipients have to have in place so that they understand how to determine and verify that a duplication of benefits isn't going to occur. And then also, if one does happen to occur, that there are measures in place so that the overage of the assistance is going to be repaid. So the policies and procedures have to have a mechanism for assessing whether or not there is a duplication and a methodology for repayment in the off chance that a duplication does occur. These policies and procedures apply to ESG-CV funds. They apply to ESG annual funds that are used to prevent, prepare, and respond to coronavirus. And they also apply if you're using other funding under the CARES Act, such as the Community Development Block Grant, so that's CDBG, CV funds, Housing Opportunity for Persons with AIDS, which is HOPWA CV funds. So it pertains to ESG, but it's also important to note if you are receiving multiple kinds of funding under the CARES Act, then those would all be a part of your duplication of benefits analysis and also your duplication of benefits policies and procedures. On the next slide, we'll walk through what that analysis really looks like. It really is a four-part analysis. The first part being at the household level to determine what the need is. What is the total cost that the household needs for their rental assistance, for any kinds of arrears, for really understanding what the household costs are. That's the first step. The next step is to determine what other assistance the household has received. Have they received maybe a security deposit from a local charity? Have they received rental assistance from other kinds of funding sources? So having that dialogue with the household about what other funding they've already received for the costs that were identified when you assessed the need. Once you know what the total need is, and then once you know what other sources have already paid for some of those costs, then you determine what the unmet need is. Okay, we know the cost amount is this, they've received this amount, here is what is still left. This is the balance of what they still have to pay. So that is the amount that ESG-CV can cover, so that you're verifying you haven't duplicated any of the other costs. And the final step is to document that analysis, because it's really important to know if you've had that conversation, gotten all that information, done that analysis, that you're 3/4 of the way there. But you also have to write it down and have the record to show the analysis that you did, the conclusion that you made, and to very clearly show this is the amount of ESG-CV assistance that we used. This was what the unmet need was. Look, we duplicated nothing. There is not a duplication here. So these are the kinds of records that clarity at the front end when you're doing the analysis will save you a lot of time down the road when there's ever a time to do a record review. So it's important to know with duplication of benefits that in many ways it's the same thing that you're always doing when you're working with households. You want to know what the need is, what the resources are. This is just a little bit more formalized in the policies and procedures around it, and then the records that you need to keep pertaining to it. I'm going to toss it back to Matt now.
Thanks, Nora. All of California essentially represents a high cost, low vacancy rental market. It can be especially challenging to locate available rapid rehousing units in this market. So I want to talk through some important strategies that will help you to address this challenge. First, we need to utilize all available landlord and property management incentives for participation in rapid rehousing. ESG-CV funds provide some useful flexibilities that may potentially attract otherwise reluctant landlords. Funds can be used to pay for landlord incentives for up to 3 times the rent charged for a unit, including the signing bonus, the security deposits, repairing damages incurred by the program participant that aren't covered by the security deposit, or that are incurred while the program participant is still residing in the unit, and the cost of extra cleaning or maintenance. Sponsor-based rental assistance is a strategy for rapid rehousing where the recipient or subrecipient executes a lease with a landlord or a property manager, and then sublets those units to eligible program participants. Many program participants will have challenging backgrounds with criminal records, past evictions, or lack of sufficient credit history. By sponsoring the unit on behalf of the program participant, the recipient or subrecipient is bypassing the landlord's tenant selection criteria that would otherwise make executing the lease unattainable for a participant. The benefit to the landlord is guaranteed rent and reducing the hassle and cost associated with unit turnover. We've experimented with the sponsor-based model of rapid rehousing in Houston and other jurisdictions, and we're seeing some promising results. A social service agency acting as a ESG-CV recipient enters into a lease agreement for a defined number of units at an apartment complex. The property manager is guaranteed rent. That property manager has a point of contact to call if any issues arise, and they no longer have to deal with the cumbersome process of managing unit turnover. All of those functions are managed by the rapid rehousing sponsor. The program participant has a way to access rental properties that may otherwise be unattainable due to their challenging client background issues. You are encouraged to explore this model of rapid rehousing if landlords in your jurisdiction are reluctant to participate because of criminal backgrounds of participants, And those backgrounds tend to be major challenges in your community. Another option is shared housing. Many of us have experience with shared housing, either as young renters newly on our own or maybe in college. Roommates are a common standard agreement for people trying to reduce the cost of housing. Finding a roommate and managing roommate tensions can be challenging, but this is a common housing practice, and we need to pursue roommates and shared housing when we are in high cost rental areas such as California. Some additional strategies. Another key to success in high cost rental markets is a dedicated staff person at your project who's committed to the process of recruiting and retaining landlords. Often these are staff dedicated to this particular function. They work exclusively in marketing and landlord development capacity and maintaining those landlord relationships. Rapid rehousing case managers oftentimes are just not trained or equipped to perform effective landlord engagement and retention. Identifying a dedicated landlord recruitment staff person allows the case management staff to focus on the hard work of client relations and housing planning. Some other strategies you'll want to explore: maybe processing rent payments on time and issuing other payments in a quick turnaround fashion to be as efficient and accelerate the rent payment as much as possible. This is going to build credibility with landlords and allow you to recruit more properties. Providing an additional damage mitigation fund can also persuade otherwise reluctant landlords to participate in rapid rehousing. We've seen from national reviews that these mitigation funds will likely go unused. Simply having the availability of them provides greater assurances to skeptical landlords. Also consider recruiting trusted partners in your community to conduct outreach to prospective landlords on your behalf. Sometimes mayors or clergy or business people can be effective spokespersons for the rapid rehousing program. Now Nora is going to share some rapid rehousing best practices.
Thanks, Matt. As we talked over the years, we've learned lessons about successful rapid rehousing models and practices, and they've really organized into three key areas. The first of which relates to housing identification, the second of which relates to move-in and rent assistance, and the third is more related to housing-focused case management. So for robust housing identification and best practices in this area, we know that client choice of location is a key element. It leads not only to client stability in the long term, but also just general satisfaction with program and really developing a household and participant agency when they are able to be the ones locating where they're going to be living. Like Matt just raised, the importance of landlord engagement strategies with specialized staff who really cultivate landlord relationships at the front end and also really work to retain those relationships over time. It's not just about developing a successful landlord partnership with the sign off at the front end. That does take a lot of work and a lot of energy, but once you've done all of that work, everyone's put in all that energy, you want to make sure that you have a strategy to retain landlords. That can be done through some formalized partnerships with landlords or property management companies. It also can be done with a flexibility of approach, recognizing that landlords operate in different markets with different standards, and you can have the flexibility of thinking because the resources allow you to be flexible and tailoring packages to meet those local standards. Rent and move-in strategies are also another area where we've seen some best practices, where we've also taken on the idea that housing markets are different. We also know that households are different. So approaching rapid rehousing in an individualized way, rather than this is our standard package of assistance. We are always going to provide X amount of rent assistance for X amount of time. That approach just doesn't work because it doesn't recognize the reality of people's situations or the reality of different markets or just needs as they arise. So it's important to be tailored, to be flexible on the length and depth of financial assistance, while also always working with other local resources that can be able to connect the household to provide those supports that can occur over time, and also to have resources in case when those unpredictable but urgent costs arise, because we know that so often household stability can be really undermined by a crisis with a vehicle or something pertaining to a health crisis. So making sure that households are connected to all the supports within the community really helps to prevent that kind of crisis to crisis mentality and build stability over time. We also know that it's important with the specific payments to landlords for the rent and move-in assistance to have a clear process and workflow for those payments so that landlords are paid on time, they receive the correct amount of funding, and that helps to build the stability of the program and just the reputation of the program within landlords, because they know that this is a good partnership where they will be receiving the funding, they'll be receiving the rent at the time at which they plan to receive it. So those are some strategies related to the move-in and rent assistance. And related to housing-focused case management, it's important to know that rapid rehousing, the intention of it is to rehouse people from a housing crisis. We know that it is not an anti-poverty program. It is not going to solve all the issues related to either a particular household's poverty situation or even community or larger picture, but that's okay because it's housing, it's resolving the current housing crisis. And that is very useful, not just to the household, but also to the community. So that focus is just important to recognize that is meeting the program design, the program intention. It's also important with case managed to recognize that being focused on housing first, taking a trauma-informed and strengths-based approach is really vital, because that gets back to the other point about all households are different. Every household is going to come to the program with different needs, but also different strengths, different opportunities that are going to meet their particular abilities and their particular approach to where they want to go now that the crisis of the housing has been resolved. So it's important to recognize that, to support that, provide those individualized and household specific services, and always be looking from initial contact with the household to building a plan to resolving the housing crisis on an ongoing basis. So the initial resource relates to the rapid rehousing, funds someone so that they are no longer homeless, and then the housing stability case management really helps the household so that they have a plan and immediately are working towards a solution to future housing crises. Those are some of the best practices that we want to share about the model. And I think on our next slide, I think that is really the basis of the content that we have. So we thank you for your attention and for your listening. And I think Chris is going to close us out.
Thanks, Nora, and thanks, Matt, for today's presentation. And thank you for attending this California Housing and Community Development Training session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services contract. Please note that this training series features over a dozen sessions that you can view at your leisure.